today. Another great topic. Today we're going to focus on managing cyber risk. This is obviously something that we're all concerned about. I'm very excited about our webinar today. And joining me today is Dmitriy Sandler. So this is part two of a series, right? Part two of three. Our second time speaking with Dmitriy, and really appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Do you want to just share a little bit about yourself and some background information on you and our?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Dmitriy Sandler. As Steve said, I'm the director of pre-sales engineering for the enterprise segment at Arctic Wolf. Again, thank you everybody for your time today and for joining us for part two of our three-part series. My background, I've been in pre-sales for a little over, probably a little over a decade, ranging in infrastructure and security solutions, working with clients all the way from the Fortune 100 to small, medium-sized businesses. The reality, right, is everybody has security gaps and security needs. So I'm just really happy to join you guys today and talk about cyber risk.
Excellent. Well, certainly happy to have you here. And I just want to mention a couple, I'll say, house cleaning items before we get started. So, one of the things I mentioned is this is part of a series and is part two of three. So 2 weeks ago, we did part one. We focused on really the MDR piece, and that's available and recorded if you weren't able to attend that. Today is part two of the series. And then we do have a part three coming up in a couple of weeks on April 8th. So feel free to register for that, or if you want us to do it for you, we're happy to do that. But just please put yes in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that you get registered for that. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about cyber risk, and this is something that's top of mind for everyone in all industries across the board, all companies, all sizes, everything around the world. So if I look at just kind of how we've tried to organize the information to get through this all today. Why is it so important, cyber risk? How do we lower your risk, right? So how do we do that? And then we'll go through some of the key benefits of the program and those kind of things, and some Q&A. I want to emphasize that the intention is for this to be interactive. So if you have questions, certainly Dmitry and I will try to make it more of a discussion than a presentation, but if you're not seeing what you want to see, if there's something specific that you want to see, please raise your hand, or just enter a question in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that gets addressed. So please do that. So we'll start here. Why is managing cyber risk so important? And I laugh when I say this. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the why, but it's a little rhetorical, this question, quite honestly, because we all know it's important, right? That's at the end of the day, it's really what it's all about. That's the magical piece about this. Can we find a way to help people manage cyber risk? Because if we can do that, I think that's the answer everybody's looking for. So it's again a little bit rhetorical from that perspective. Anything to add to that, Dmitry?
No, I mean, right. It's everybody's under attack. That's just the reality that we face today. Unfortunately, it's the world we live in, and so if you have a technology presence, which I think today everybody does, you're under threat, and so the risk is there.
Indeed it is. And so I want to go so far as to say, not only is it important, but it is the most important thing. And KPMG just came out with a study and said cybersecurity risk is the number one threat to growth. So this is a huge concern for all industries around the world, quite honestly. So you can see and hear that this pulse survey that KPMG does, they do it multiple times. Certainly in 2020, it was really about COVID, and there were some specific concerns around that. And here we are, in March now, in February, March of 2021, cybersecurity risk is the number one threat to growth of organizations around the world. And I think that's material in saying that. And then I just want to, kind of dig in a little bit on this topic, Dmitry. And these are very public data breaches. They've probably even been overused, right? And I know we've used them several times, but I highlight these because they do such a good job of really emphasizing what can happen if you don't do the right things, right? And so we'll start all the way at the beginning, 2017, the Equifax breach, right? The flaw was known. It was caught by a vulnerability scanner, but nobody remediated the vulnerability. And I see this all the time in the enterprise, and it's such a huge problem. And so that's one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that knowing about the vulnerabilities, it's a very important part of the problem. You can't fix it if you don't know about it first, right? So it's very important. There's no question, absolutely. But knowing about the vulnerabilities doesn't lower your risk. And Equifax it certainly understands that now, right? The only way to lower your risk is to fix the problem, right? To actually remediate the vulnerabilities. And I think, that's a recurring theme that we see all the time, and it's something that we need to address. 99%, it's worth noting, 99% of attacks are from known vulnerabilities, right? So if you fix the vulnerabilities, just imagine this, 99% of the attack surface is just taken right off the table. I think it's a huge thing. It's a huge thing. So then if we move on to 2019, right? This is the Capital One breach, right? 100 million credit card application accounts found. Why? Because there was a misconfiguration in the cloud. It's astounding when you think about that. That, like, you would hope that a customer like this would know better, right? But this is a common problem, quite honestly, right? And it's something that we're all experiencing. We're all moving workloads to the cloud, and we're all trying to do it quickly, right? And so one of the primary benefits, I think, of the cloud is ease of use and how easy it is to set up resources and all those things. That's a blessing and a curse, right? So it's very easy for somebody to just set something up, customer data ends up in there, move forward, and then there's a configuration flaw. So my question is, like, is anybody checking cloud configurations? Like, wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great if somebody was checking your cloud configurations, right? I mean, this is a common part of the program, and it's a very common problem, right? What are you seeing about that, Dmitry?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, I was going to say, it's cloud is easy, cloud is fast, but I think a lot of folks overlook sometimes that when you're designing a data center, right, in kind of the traditional way, you're thinking about all of those barriers. You have your firewalls, you have your physical walls, you're thinking about it in a more traditional, secure way. Cloud, really easy, really simple to get going. And you kind of assume and hope that everything's safe, but it really isn't. You really do have to spend a lot of time and resources to make sure that it's locked down. So absolutely that we're starting to see more and more of the attacks focus in that space. And again, we'll spend part 3 digging more into cloud security, but absolutely a very critical component as well.
Yep. And the last one, from June is the Honda breach, which was a control system data breach, right? So these are devices that can't get an agent. So a lot of times they get missed in vulnerability scans and those kind of things. But I think what's really important to understand is that all connected devices are targets, all of them, right? And so if they're connected, then they're a potential problem, and you have to first know that the device exists, right? And second, know that the vulnerabilities exist before you can even remediate those. So I think that, again, these make a very good statement about the greater challenge, and one of the things worth highlighting is, even though it's easy to assume that the question, why is cyber risk important, is rhetorical, right? That's like, it's obvious, right? We all know that. It's something that we all know, but we still all make mistakes, and they're very costly. They can be very costly. So I wanted to just spend a little bit of time going through some specific things about vulnerabilities that we see all the time, right? So, there's so many high profile vulnerabilities happening. And then boards, oftentimes they go to the CISO or the security department, they say, hey, are we vulnerable to this? Or ask some kind of question, right? That's and I think that, by being able to answer that question puts a lot of times I say that our job is to give people the information they need to make good business decisions. But certainly if the board is putting pressure on you about some vulnerabilities, then having the information available to provide them is key. And I think when we look at these high profile vulnerabilities, this is serious stuff, right? And if it's not fixed, then the bad guys are going to put you on a list and they're going to exploit it for sure. But what are the questions that are asked? What's our exposure to this vulnerability? So being able to definitively respond to that question, I think, is key. And if we look at the types of vulnerabilities that are happening, by being able to have this breadth of identification of assets and identification of vulnerabilities and being able to answer this question, I think is going to make boards a lot more comfortable, quite honestly. So any thoughts on that as I toggle through these? I think we have a few of them.
I think the overarching theme, right, is that these things keep popping up more and more often, right? So we just had the Exchange vulnerability that came up a couple weeks back, and they're more and more public and broader in their reach. And so every time one of them comes up, there are going to be questions immediately around what's our exposure, what's what issues are we going to face? And so again, having the ability to not only know about it, but be able to address and remediate it becomes very critical. And again, as we saw earlier, knowing about it isn't always enough, and most often actually is not enough, right? Kind of the whole knowing is half the battle. Well, you can't win if you only fought half the battle. You gotta fight the whole thing. So
right, but you can't fight the second half of the battle if you don't know about it. So you have to do that. I wanted to just the ad hoc vCenter query. So just talk about this, because when the board comes to you and says, hey, are we vulnerable to this exploit? Sometimes the amount of data we have, we're like, I don't know, right? I've got like 50 million things to look at. How do I even know? How do I even discern it? And so how do we address that?
I mean, again, I think part of it is having the right tools in place, but having the tools that are able to appropriately and adequately scan for those things, right? Again, there are a lot of different vulnerabilities, both external and internal and endpoint, right? There are a lot of things that have that potential exposure. So having the tools in place is definitely the first step to be able to do that. And again, tools, and we'll talk about this later on as well, right? It's not about running a vulnerability assessment once a year. That's great, but there's the 364 other days of the year where you're still at risk. Yeah. So it's having the right tools, but then also having the right people and processes and procedures in place to then understand what the implications of those vulnerabilities are, because there's also varying degrees of vulnerability and various implications of said vulnerabilities. And then also understanding how to remediate those. Again, some are going to be significantly higher exposure, right? If your Exchange or your vCenter or your critical applications and widespread applications are exposed, that's a pretty serious problem versus, again, there are some cases where it's a minor vulnerability that's maybe not as prevalent or not as relevant. And again, having the ability to understand what the prioritization, what the risk assessment is, it's really crucial. Otherwise, a lot of it just becomes noise and we don't even know where to focus.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And then just specifically, if a vulnerability comes out, being able to query around that specific vulnerability and find out where all that vulnerability you're exposed to to a specific thing. And you mentioned the exchange issue. This is huge. I mean, this is the kind of thing that just freaks me out, quite honestly, because people are how many people run Exchange server? I mean, come on. But so you the move to the cloud, there's a rush to the cloud and to go into cloud-based email and all those other things. But a lot of people still, leverage on-premise installed Exchange server either as a backup or as a, as a repository, as a second. There are so many businesses that are vulnerable to this, right? There's no wonder that boards are saying, hey, are we vulnerable to this, right? Of course they are, right? It's just amazing.
And again, right, I mean, your email system is absolutely critical to operations. If that gets breached, you're facing some serious issues. But one of the interesting things we saw with this was some of the initial patches to this vulnerability also had vulnerabilities. So again, we saw a lot of customers rush to patch and we're like, hey, we're done. Everything's fixed. And, the Arctic Wolf customers we were able to look over and say, actually, turns
Hold
out
on a
not
second.
so
That's
much.
great. You still have a vulnerability, and this is a common problem. And I'm glad you brought that up, Dmitry, because this is it's the one and done syndrome, right? Like finish one thing and move on to the next thing. And so do the patch, which is fantastic. It's fantastic that people were able to get the patch deployed quickly. But that said, just to move on to something and assume everything is peachy is not good in this case, right? So that's so I want to move into segment number 2, which is really about, so what do we do about this, right? So there's clearly a problem. There's every day we hear about new vulnerabilities, and if somebody is in charge of managing vulnerabilities, they're probably acutely aware of this problem, right? There's new vulnerabilities showing up all the time. So how do we address the problem, right? So I want to dig in on that a little bit. And one of the things that just, okay, so let's just put a stake in the ground and make a statement, right? We think the ONEteam MDR MSOC Plus program will help address this problem. And that's, I want to get to the, to the meat of what is it and how does it help, right? So that ONEteam is basically Arctic Wolf plus, it's not basically, it is, right? It's Arctic Wolf plus ASMGi. And what I want to do is just take the best of what you do and combine it with the best of what we do and develop a program. That's what we set out to accomplish with this program. But the purpose is to lower risk. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. And if we can go all the way back to that first statement, right, to get there, I want to just not spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to highlight that MDR, it's a ONEteam solution. It is a total solution. And when the way we define a total solution is build a program, adopt the technology, build out, operationalize it, right? Build out the operating model that supports it. And you need to be able to achieve these things in all cases. So I want to make that point because I think it's important to know that if any one of those pieces are missing, then it is not a total solution. And you're gonna be under adopted or under deployed, or you're not going to utilize the value, or you're still going to be at risk, quite honestly. And so just to dig in a little bit on what the program is, we talked about this some as it relates to MDR, and we'll revisit this probably again, but the MDR, the ONEteam MDR MSOC Plus program contains everything that Arctic Wolf does, and then some things that we do, the plus, right? Plus the cyber incident response and forensics and the vulnerability management and remediation. So I just wanted to highlight that, today's webinar is really about the managed risk piece and the vulnerability management and remediation, right? So we'll just take all the incident response stuff off. It still exists, but that is the nature of the program. And let's just dig in on these things a little bit. So I love this model that Arctic Wolf created around proactive, reactive, and active. What are the components of a total solution? So it's really focused on addressing the same things. And again, today our focus is on managed risk. Last time we talked about MDR, so we won't spend any time going through that. Security operations, it's always there. It really, makes all of this stuff work. There's no question. But can you elaborate a little bit just on the managed risk piece of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is understanding that the managed risk component is proactive, right? So when we talked about MDR, that's right. Once somebody's actually actively in, how do we deal with that, right? That's the reaction piece. Ideally, you want to do everything you can up front to eliminate as many attack vectors as possible. And that's where the managed risk component comes in. The biggest part of that is going to be having very strong vulnerability assessment, right? It's understanding what are the attack surfaces that are available in your environment and how do we lock them down, right? So to your point earlier, right, if we can take out 99% of those attack vectors, well, we just saved ourselves a lot of sleepless nights. And then at the same time, we're looking at things like account takeover, right? So scanning dark and gray web information for again, account takeover issues or domain and account breaches. Again, looking at a very different attack vector, but still trying to see what is the possibility of somebody trying to attack you before they actually do, right? We certainly want to have the reactive component, but let's do whatever we can up front And again, it's understanding at the same time as we're doing all of these things, it's being able to understand what are the different risk profiles. What do I need to deal with in what priority? What is my exposure level for each of those things? And again, looking at things across the entire network, endpoints, network, web servers, right, applications, et cetera. Really having that holistic assessment of what is my risk profile across all of these different avenues. And then as Steve, you mentioned multiple times, it's now that we know, how are we going to remediate this, right? Now that I know what those issues are, it's having that plan of going to fix it in the right priority, in the right manner, and having this as a continual process, right? It's not a one and done. This needs to be something that is constantly ongoing. And then again, that does roll into the active component, right, of the continuous interaction with both, our CST, our concierge security team, and the ONEteam folks at ASMGi, of having that 24/7 human intelligence on top of the artificial intelligence, 24/7 eyes on glass. Somebody is actively looking through all of this data on your behalf, making sure that you are covered every single day of the week.
Yep. That's such an important part. I have a great story, and we have an existing customer, and we're working together to deliver this solution. But and this is a user behavior analytics part, right, around account takeover. And what's interesting is that we, the normal dwell time or time that an attacker is on a company's network is 206 days, which is mind-boggling to me, right? That's an average. It's not always that long, but we can identify with your help, right, in minutes when an intruder is there. And so we have a customer, and they had, from a user behavior analytics stuff, they have multiple offices, but all their operations are in the continental US. There was a login from, in Nigeria, quite honestly. And so immediately a flag goes up. In minutes, a flag goes up. In less than an hour, we were able to identify the problem and remediate the problem. And the way that we remediate the problem was log the user out of every place that they're logged in, change the passwords, do all these things, zero damage. So this is a huge success story, but it's a good example of how important that active component is, right? So you can do risk management all day long, but if you don't have that active component, you're not a total solution, right? That's you'll miss those things, and damage happens. These damage does happen if somebody has the time to figure out how to navigate through your enterprise, or do certain things. Damage will definitely happen. So this is about the proactive piece, manage risk. So this is about preempting issues and fixing vulnerabilities and things like that. But why don't you just spend a little bit of time, Dmitriy, just talking through what makes up managed risk in general?
Yeah. Again, I think part of the focus for us is to make sure that this is a holistic approach. So again, it's a combination of external vulnerability assessments as well as internal configuration management and controls. Because again, if you only focus on one of those, you're still leaving yourself really, really open. And a big component of that is the asset identification, right? So it's because we're able to insert ourselves into the network, we can actually scan, again, we'll kind of get to some of the technology later, but we have agents that we can deploy on endpoints and things like that that can help with configuration management, things like that. But we can actually detect anything that's on your network, right? So we use, pretty much anything that's on layer 2 or routable on layer 3, we can detect and run assessments against for both asset classification identification, which then allows us to also classify things based on asset type. So again, as we talk about not just knowing vulnerabilities, but being able to understand what our risk profile is, we'll see this later on as well, but by being able to classify all of your different assets, we can isolate the risk profiles and understand where our biggest exposures are. And all of this is done automatically. Again, we're leveraging human intelligence on top of all of this. So we are doing, quarterly risk reviews to make sure that we are covering everything in the environment and to relay all of this information back to make sure that we're not missing anything, that we're helping you deploy everything appropriately, and that we're covering everything. Obviously, if there is anything in terms of existing vulnerabilities, we can create very very quickly create incidents and tickets so that we can go on to the remediation component. And then again, focus on not just your external facing applications and any exposed assets from an external vulnerability scan, but also look at things internally from a configuration management and monitoring perspective as well. So we really look at this as, again, a very holistic approach. We have to cover as much ground as possible, right? Because right, you can't secure what you can't see, right? If we're not looking at all of these things, we're not able to really tell you that, hey, yeah, you actually have a very strong security posture, because you're really leaving yourself open. So our approach is very different in that we're not looking to offer a tool. We're providing a security, it's security operations essentially, right? It is a service that looks at everything versus just a point product that is designed to do, one thing and then let you deal with it. We're really looking at it as a full partnership and service offering.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great response. And I'll tell you what really resonates with me, Dmitry, and what I really appreciate is how comprehensive the visibility is, right? It isn't just one facet of it. And so, when we talk about vulnerability management all the time at ASMGi, and a lot of interaction with customers and various different things. And if people are putting security patches on operating systems, a lot of times that's called vulnerability management. It's a part of it, but there's so many other places where, bad things can happen, right? You have to look at everything. I want to address a question that just came up, and I'll back up in the slides a little bit because I think this is a great place to address this. But the question is, what's the difference between MDR and SOC? Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, I've got another great slide that maybe we can pull up in another session. But MDR, as was part of the question, it's really just one component of what a SOC is, right? So MDR is just the components that make up that detection response. And it's usually, MDR itself is really focused around some of the tools. So you might have a SIM and some rules in place. When you look at a SOC, a security operations center is so much more than just those tools. It's the R&D component, it's the development, it's the remediation, it's the playbooks. And frankly, it's a lot of human investment and human capital to actually man all of that, design it, and continuously operate that. Right. So MDR is really a partial, right? It's a subset of what Security Operations Center provides. Again, from a Arctic Wolf and ASMGi perspective, the Security Operations Center as a service, MDR is one of the offerings that make up the Security Operations Center as a service. Managed risk, cloud security posture management are some of the others. But then again, the reason we're offering SOC and not just MDR is we are offering that whole solution, the playbooks, the MDR, right? All of the intelligence. We're not giving you a SIM and saying, yep, here's your log collection and have fun. It's that whole wrapper around it. We are the Security Operations Center. Yep.
And that's a great response, and I appreciate that. And if you tied it to the active, reactive, proactive model, right? The SOC is the active piece. This is where you actually get things done and do it, right? MDR, to your point, is manage, detect, and response by definition. It is reactive, right? You're detecting something bad has happened, right? And so, but you need the SOC to be able to investigate it further and do all those other things, and certainly to resolve the problem. So that's a great question. Part B of this question was that you say that ASMGi does this, but in this slide, it looks like Arctic Wolf does it under MDR. And so I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on this, and you can certainly chime in, but I think that's the whole point, that this program called MDR MSOC Plus is everything that Arctic Wolf does. It would completely leverage Arctic Wolf in our total solution approach, right? So a lot of times we say powered by Arctic Wolf, right? So we're bringing your SOCs, the folks that are there, and your technology, and identifying these IOCs, all of the threat intelligence that goes into that, and making that part of our solution. And I think it's important to highlight that, where, this isn't this isn't us just trying to do it on our own and have a webinar with Arctic Wolf. We're actually leveraging this solution that you provide. Do you want to elaborate on that at all? Or
yeah, there's nobody that does everything, right? And anybody that says they do is frankly not being quite honest. So we're focused on providing the best SOC as a service as possible. But as part of the overall security of any organization, there are many other aspects that we aren't going to provide, right? And that's where, again, this is a great partnership where we provide the SOC as a service, all of the technology, the backend technology stack, the tools, the human intelligence, right, all of the underlying components that bring you the solutions up, or the security operations center. But there are going to be things like, again, for example, certain managed services or other aspects that we're not going to be offering. And that's where, Steve, I think you and your teams, as part of our partnership, step in and kind of take that to the next step for those customers that require those services.
Yep. And I think managed risk is a great example of that, right? And if we go all the way back to the beginning slides about, your risk isn't lowered by knowing about the vulnerabilities. Your risk is lowered when you remediate them. But you have to know about them to do that, right? So that's a great segue. So I'm going to toggle past this. I love this slide, and it's awesome because there, we interact with a lot of enterprises that do point in time scans, right? Vulnerability scans, either quarterly or yearly, PCI requirements for doing vulnerability scans, those kind of things. They, and some monthly, there's no question. But one of the points I like this, because if you do point in time scans and you do remediation with it, that's the thing I want to note, right? Then your risk theoretically, if you're doing remediations, your risk goes down, and then over time it goes back up because new vulnerabilities are identified. And so it goes up until you, whoops, sorry about that, until you, do another scan, right? And so during this time, the risk is growing, and because the number of risks are growing. And then you do a scan, and then you kick off a remediation project, and the risk goes back down, and then it goes back up, and those kind of things. So the one point I want to make about the point in time is, if you don't actually do the remediation, your risk just keeps going up, right? And certainly the number of risks keep going up. But what's key, I think, comparatively to that, if you leverage this program where we're identifying the vulnerabilities continuously, not at a point in time, so it's a continuous scan, and I think it's an important differentiator, but also remediating those, right? And so I want to mention that when we onboard a new customer, we have some time that we call, we build a plan, basically, right? So you start identifying all these vulnerabilities. It's possible and probable to have a rush of vulnerabilities and that you didn't know about, right? And so all of a sudden you have all these vulnerabilities to fix, and it's not magic. You don't just snap your fingers and be done. So we create what's called a get well plan. So we create a plan to get somebody into compliance and get rid of all of these high vulnerabilities and get their risk score to a more manageable level. Once that happens, we'll never be out of compliance, because we identify the vulnerabilities, we remediate them, identify them, remediate them, identify, and this curve becomes reality, right? And so it's a big difference, but I wanted to point that out. There's a huge benefit to continuously identifying vulnerabilities and continuously remediating vulnerabilities. And I just can't emphasize how important that is in managing your overall security posture or your risk as an organization. Anything to add to that, Dmitry?
Oh, absolutely. I think, again, we've talked about this a couple of times already, but I think one of the challenge of tools is they're designed to do something and then they stop. And so most tools out there will do at best, a quarterly scan, which is great in that moment. But like you said, there's things that are going to pop up over the next 3 months. The difference in the offering, or one of the many differences in our offering, is this is a continual process. It's a journey, right? It's a joint journey throughout the security posture. It's not a let's come back every 3 months and look at this. We have to know constantly and consistently. And again, we're from an Arctic Wolf perspective, we're leveraging not only commercially available feeds, but because we have so much intel on what's going on with other customers and what's going on in the field, we're also building our own internal feed mechanisms as well. So we have a really, really broad, visibility across different vulnerabilities that may not be known yet, right, on the commercial feeds. So it's really being able to apply that continuously from a broad set of feeds, so to say, and intelligence.
Yep. I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the architecture of the managed risk environment. How do we do this? How do we identify all these vulnerabilities and assets?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of this is deploying a managed risk scanner, right? So this is a vulnerability scanner. We have both virtual and physical options available depending on the specifics of the environment. We'll touch on some of the cloud scanning in our next session, so I won't go too deep into that. But again, the point of this is once our tools are in place, or those scanners are in place, we're going to be able to do a network inventory, right, immediately. Because we are on the network, we can essentially now see everything that touches your network, and be able to perform internal vulnerability assessment, vulnerability scans continuously. And same thing from an external perspective, we're able to look at external vulnerability assessment of any public facing assets, obviously publicly accessible ports and services, and do configuration management, kind of lockdown around that as well. Again, following the OWASP top 10 profile. I touched on this earlier, but we are, as part of this service, it's not just about vulnerability assessment. We are also looking at the dark web, or the gray web, so to say, for any potential security gaps that we can find there as well. So really trying to cover it from both internal and external, and then again, not just your server assets or things like that, but also looking at potential account breaches and account takeover risk. And then again, looking at the endpoints, right? So as I mentioned earlier, we have an agent that can be deployed on your endpoints. So we're able to now also do not just a hardware inventory, but also software inventory from that perspective, and start looking at configuration benchmarks. So not just vulnerability assessment, but are you configuring your assets properly and in a safe and reliable manner? So again, it's vulnerabilities are probably the thing that we talk about most as part of managed risk, but it really does extend far beyond that. And that's where we're leveraging the scanners, the agents, and our ISOC and CSTs to really combine the technology and the human component of it to really get that full broad spectrum of intelligence. And then again, not just get that information, but present that to you in a very easy to consume and easy to understand manner via dashboards, reports, constant interaction with your concierge security team as well. And this can be fully customized to your needs, right? So depending on what frequency you prefer of scans, reports, interaction, right? Anything that you need. Our goal is to understand what your specific environment is like and what your needs are and what your plans are as well, so that we can tailor, again, the service, because we're not a product, right? We can tailor the service to best meet your needs and your environmental realities, to make sure that you are as protected as possible, again, preemptively. And then certainly we can deal with any other issues as part of the reactive MDR components.
Yep, perfect. This just kind of speaking directly to the things I think that you just said, right? Just from a feature standpoint, anything to talk through from a managed risk standpoint that
I think, just again, I would just underscore that it's a very broad assessment. It's not focused on any one specific thing. We are looking at a very broad, right, kind of, so think of depth and breadth of intelligence and data gathering. We want to make sure that we are covering every single aspect that we possibly can, and providing you the intel around that in a very simple to understand, and also, frankly, right, we talked about early on, the board or somebody at the top asking, well, are we exposed, or what's our exposure, by being able to take this information and digest it for you and be able to allow you and enable you to present this in a very easy to consume manner, so that there isn't a half hour digging effort to try to understand what your exposure might be. You have all of this information available to you via your dashboard, via custom reports, whatever is necessitated in that situation.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think what really resonates with me, Dmitry, is just, this breadth of visibility and just how comprehensive this is. It's an external vulnerability scan, a host-based vulnerability scan, an internal vulnerability scan. And so those things are critically important. And, to your point, and that we know from experience how accommodating your team is to individual needs. And that's really our philosophy for go-to-market anyway, right? So that said, is like we always structure programs the way people can best consume them and the way that's best utilized by them specifically. And I just want to point out, like, a common thing that I see in vulnerabilities, it's vulnerability management is a great example, right? But the plan, a lot of times, if the plan, which is where the strategy goes, right, and the SLAs and those kind of thing goes, like I've seen sometimes in a policy or a plan, it says we won't have any highs or critical vulnerabilities for more than 30 days or more than 60 days or whatever, and then do quarterly vulnerability scans, right? And the comment I always
you
make,
don't know them, you don't have them, right?
Yeah, I suppose, until you get breached, right? That's the reality. But it's impossible. It's impossible to meet those strategic criteria if you only scan quarterly, right? So this is one of the things that I love about continuous vulnerability scanning, to go back to that other slide, right? It's one of the things that I love about continuous vulnerability scanning, is we have the ability to meet very stringent SLAs as a result of that, right? So create a vulnerability plan that speaks to your strategic objectives and those kind of things, and then get you there and keep you there, be compliant with your own corporate objectives. I wanted to spend a little bit of time just going through the specifics. This is a real thing, right? So this is the kind of information that we can provide to people. Do you want to elaborate on some of these different things in the risk portal? Or
yeah, and there's some breakdowns as well on this that we can go through. But again, part of this is we want to be able to provide you a very high level viewpoint, as well as be able to dig into the specifics as well. So some of this is as simple as, right, what is your actual risk score, right? We can dig into the specifics, but if you can log in and see, right, do you have a high risk score? Are you doing pretty well? And then compare that to your industry, right? So you can see there at the top, there's an industry risk score. How are you relative to others within the industry, so to say? Are you doing better in terms of your risk analysis and protection than others? That's certainly what we strive for with everybody, and trying to raise the overall numbers as well.
Yeah.
And then again, you can see, right, the unresolved risks. We want to see that number as close to zero as possible, but this, again, this allows you a very quick overview of the environment before you start digging into all of the specifics. And again, we can look at the asset class health, right? So I talked about being able to classify different assets by different types, so we can treat them independently and differently based on their risk assessments. Network health and network status, right? And what's my exposure across all of the network discovered devices? So there's a lot of information that we present, and we can present that to you, again, anything from a high level to a really detailed assessment, depending on what it is that you're looking to, what question you're looking to answer, so to say. Certainly, right, if it's a general question from the board or somebody around what's the exposure, this is a nice part of a report that we can introduce. But obviously, from a mitigation and remediation perspective, we can drill into the more specific subsets of the dashboard as we kind of scroll down into the details.
Yeah. I'll keep moving here.
Yeah.
The goal is to get through material, and feel free, guys, audience, to jump in with questions. So these are some of the things that you talked about as I toggle through that. So quarterly reports. So one of the things that we'll do with customers is schedule regular reporting, right? So it's being able to demonstrate that your security posture is improving and that your risks are being lowered and those kind of things, and being able to demonstrate that. Do you want to speak through any or highlight anything on the quarterly report?
So the one thing I would say is, even though we call this a quarterly report, this doesn't mean that our interaction is quarterly, right? And we've talked about this quite a lot around, right? It's not about doing something once a quarter. We want to make sure that we have a constant and consistent, not just technology component of the scans and so forth, but from a CST perspective, one of the many things that sets us apart is our CSTs. You do have assigned concierge team members, so you're talking to the same people day in, day out, but it is a very continuous interaction. That being said, we do also then publish the quarterly reports to give you a higher level and historical viewpoint of what's the trend, right? So we're dealing with our customers, day in, day out on the very specific items, but we also want to be able to provide those higher level reports on trending, for example, right? A really key aspect is, am I getting better over time? Now that we've been going through the scans and remediations, hopefully we want to see things start to improve as we're doing all of the discovery and ideally remediating everything. So again, just some really nice assets from a visual perspective to understand what's been going on. Yep. And obviously, what the remaining exposure looks like.
Yep. And one of the things I think is worth noting is that we take the data that's available and consolidate it into reports, but it can be any cadence that works for the customer, right? So we always, everything is continuous, right? We always have the data available and we can always generate a report. But the ability to go to like a board or a management team and with this information. So again, I'll highlight that our job is, obviously to lower your risk, but it's to give you the information that you need to succeed. And that's I think a critical point, right? So we want to help our customers have those conversations with leadership and with their boards that put them in a position and create that level of comfort, right? But it should be real. I want to go through some specific use cases before we stop for Q&A, but just these are some of the things that you've mentioned throughout the presentation, Dmitry, but we have some use cases that are specific to the managed risk that I want to just kind of talk through. Is there anything you want to highlight about account takeover?
I think it's something that, frankly, more people are exposed to than they realize, right? The reality is, with every one of these breaches, a lot of our data is very susceptible to being released. And so part of our risk management approach is, again, yes, as I mentioned before, right? Yes, we're doing vulnerability scans and so on and so forth, but we also want to make sure that we are looking at, is your data, has your data been exposed as part of a data breach? And is your data now available for purchase on that market? Because if that's something that we discover, we can let our customers know immediately what we've discovered. And so again, it might be as simple as, hey, these are the users that all need to change their passwords. But again, we can also then cross-correlate this with existing activity from those users to make sure, has there been something that, is suspect that may have, kind of transpired and nobody noticed, right? So it is, again, looking at a different side of risk than focusing on just assets.
Yeah. And I'll highlight, so the dark web stuff is fantastic, right? And there's a lot of data out there, and sometimes you see passwords, sometimes you don't. But what I see happening is that people use their corporate emails to sign up for something, but it could be a valid business reason, like an Adobe or whatever, and they have a data breach, and then your credentials are exposed, right? Absolutely. So I see a lot of times that passwords are actually exposed on the dark web. And you have to change your password. I mean, come on, it's available to anybody who wants it, right? For $1 or less in a lot of cases, right? So but anyway, that said, it's more than just that, right? It's more than just finding what's available on the dark web, just monitoring. And again, this goes back to that active component, the 24/7 eyes on glass. But the user behavior analytics, it's just phenomenal from an account takeover standpoint. Our experience is that the bad guys fraud comes from account takeover, right? So take over somebody's email credentials, for example, and just watch, you own their inbox, quite honestly, right? So, every email that's gone out, every communication that's happened, every person that you're communicating with, it puts you in a position to socially engineer an email to a group of people, or even get in the middle of a thread that's going back and forth, right? Emails that are going back and forth. So all kinds of bad things can happen. From an account takeover standpoint, it's a huge problem and pervasive problem. And a lot of people, to your point, right, their account is compromised and they don't even know it. We'll know that happens. So another use case item is the external vulnerability scans, right? And you've talked about this a lot, but
yeah, again, I mean, it's something that we've touched on quite extensively throughout, but we want to make sure that obviously that we are continuously scanning, not just at onboarding and deployment, but continuously scanning anything that's publicly facing, right? Your servers, your web apps, right? To not only to inventory and understand what actually is out there and exposed, but to be able to continuously and proactively essentially monitor that for any type of exposure and any potential for breach through those consistent scans.
Yep.
And again, part of that is, right, being able to present that data to you very easily to consume.
Yeah. And a couple points I'll make about the external vulnerability. This is the view that the bad guys have, right? They are outside of your network. So they see the same things. If you do a scan and identify vulnerabilities, there's a good chance that the bad guys already know about it, right? Because they run scans first to find vulnerabilities and then exploit them, right? So if you're looking for open RDP ports, for example, right? The bad guys are looking for open RDP ports. What a coincidence. And it's an external vulnerability scan. So this is public facing. I think that's a key point. It's the same view that the bad guys have of your environment, right? From the outside. If they can exploit a vulnerability to get from the outside to the inside, then those vulnerabilities become more meaningful, right? In a kill chain or attack, methodology, TTPs or whatever. But it's also, the other point that I like to make is that a lot of enterprises, as part of their vendor onboarding or vetting process, so if they're looking at your solution, they'll run an external vulnerability scan. You can buy services to do external vulnerability scans, or risk scans, I should say, because, financial risk and reputation risk and all those things. But vulnerabilities is a part of that external scans. And those are all similar to this, right? So if something shows up on your external vulnerability scan, it could show up. There could be a prospective customer who's checking you out, right? And finding that same information. So fix those vulnerabilities because they're that important. How about the network scans?
Yeah. So again, right, this goes back to scanning internal scanning across your network. And as you can see here, we're classifying everything from your endpoints and your desktops to printers, right? We're not loading any agents on printers, but let's be honest, there are a lot of things on our networks that are printers or other edge devices that we're not really monitoring. We're not deploying any tools because it's not running Windows or Linux that we're loading agents on. So we are able to automatically detect all of that and classify it, and then again assign a risk profile based on the exposure, based on the scanning, to give you all of that information very quickly and easily and continuously, so you know where you should focus.
Yep. And again, it's critically important to understand all the devices that are connecting to your network, because they all have an opportunity to be compromised, that's for sure. And they can easily be gotten to if you want to look at it that way, if they're connected, right? So identify the vulnerabilities and fix them. So host-based vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so again, this is just digging deeper into the vulnerability assessment itself, right? So giving you more information, right? So for example, what are you looking at, old versions of Windows, for example, that are giving you higher exposure, higher risk? Are you looking at specific, packages within your applications, right? So, you wrote, in this case, right, Python or OpenSSL, right? So where this is now kind of that next layer of kind of endpoint visibility and endpoint vulnerability assessment to give you a deeper understanding of what are the things more specifically, right? Not just what the assets are, but within each of those assets, what exactly are the vulnerabilities? And again, grouping them if you want to look at it from that perspective. But really, this is what gives you now the detail. And right, if you were, if we had the full portal, you'd see the more detailed information. But this is giving you the direct detail of what you need to deal with within the endpoint environment as well.
Yeah. And I would point out that these are the devices that have agents on them, right?
Correct. Yes. Yep. This is the agent based. Yep.
Yep. And then I want to get through these next couple of slides really quickly because we have a couple of questions and we're running out of time. So just from a benchmarking standpoint.
Yeah, there are a lot of different controls that we all have to adhere to. So part of our job is to make sure that we're helping you do that by mapping configuration management to those controls and showing you what controls you are and are not passing, and obviously help you kind of give you the guidance to remediate any of the specific rules or policies where you aren't in a passing state. So again, we want to make sure, right, there are a lot of different compliance metrics that our customers have to abide by, a lot of rules and regulations. We want to make sure that you are actively doing so and don't get caught off guard in an audit. And obviously, it's not just about the audit, but it's the actual risk of breach.
Yep. Yep. And it's really a consolidated report view, but being able to benchmark is critically important as well. I wanted to make sure we had time to get to this because it speaks to the benefits of leveraging this piece of a program, right, and solution and those kind of things. Anything to elaborate on here or to specifically drill into, Dmitriy?
No, I think you hit it right on the head, right? I mean, it's yeah.
Yep, perfect. And all of these things we've talked about, and we'll send these this information out if you want it. Just please ask, just request it, and we can send this information. So I want to address some of the questions. We're winding down on time here, so we have a couple of questions. One of them is, do you identify vulnerabilities for third-party software solutions like Adobe? That was the example that was given. So do you want to address that, Dmitriy?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of known CVEs for applications, so that's certainly that's absolutely a part of it, right? So again, as I mentioned earlier, we have multiple different vulnerability feeds. So that is something that if there's a known vulnerability, we can absolutely correlate that as well. Yep.
And I think that, there are a lot of things that we can identify from a host-based vulnerability standpoint, right? If there's the applications, particularly the off-the-shelf, the commercial off-the-shelf or COTS applications that are installed, including Adobe or any number of things, really. Those CVE, if there's a CVE, it's found and it shows up in the risk report. So we can know that it's a true vulnerability. So hopefully we address that question. How do we know how we compare to others in our industry?
Yep, great question. So one of the reports that we were looking at earlier, within our dashboard, within our portal, there's that industry score. So that's a very quick and easy way that we can see how each individual customer, each individual organization, how their security score relates to others in the industry. Now, again, our job is to raise that industry score. So as every individual client, as every individual organization gets better, that score in the industry should also be going up. But it's a good way to benchmark yourself against others.
Yep. Just a side note to that, are there any industries that stick out to you as particularly low risk or high risk? Or
the good and the bad is no. It's I mean, part of the challenge is we all face the same issues and the same risks. And so there might be some customers within a particular segment that are better than others, but as a general, industry of, finance versus manufacturing or healthcare, unfortunately, we see exposure across all of them. And again, even during onboarding, we very often, unfortunately, discover existing vulnerabilities or issues that had been there sitting for months and months, if not longer. So it's our goal is to get that to zero.
Yep. No, I agree with you. And I think it's a point, and we probably made this on the last webinar, and certainly in previous webinars, we have made this point. Risk applies to all industries. It's the bad guys, they don't really care what industry you're in, right? Unless it's a targeted attack, right? So, but anyway, that's a good response to that. I want to get to one more question, and then we'll have to call it quits. And if we didn't get to your questions, we'll send those to you directly. But the question is, my board asked me for this relates to the exchange vulnerability. Are we vulnerable? Are we vulnerable to this, right? So most people know that if they have, exchange or not, right? But if you do, how do you know if you're vulnerable to to that attack?
So if you're leveraging the Arctic Wolf service, right, we will know, right, because we know what to look for and what to detect. That's part of the ongoing process and ongoing scanning process. So for all of our exchange customers, that again, because we're doing that inventory, we know every customer that has exchange. We're able to proactively reach out and make sure that we are making sure that we're continuously putting all of the scanning in place to detect any potential vulnerabilities. And then again, for things that are 0-day, for example, right, we can proactively reach out with our CST team and work with them on the remediation steps necessary to avoid that. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach from that perspective. But again, it's not just the tools, it's the humans that are proactively reaching out and working with our customers to make sure that we're mitigating all of that risk.
Yep, perfect. We're past the top of the hour, so we'll be respectful of everybody's time and wrap it up. But I want to mention one last time, on April 8th, we have the third part of this series, and we're going to talk specifically about the cloud and how to manage risk in the cloud. And so we'll drill into that as well. And so please register for that if you haven't done so already, or if you want us to register you, we're happy to do that. Just type a yes in the question box and submit that. And thank you, Dmitry, for sharing your time with us today, and obviously your wisdom and drilling into these areas. And if anybody has any follow-up questions or thinks of anything that they would like to learn more about, please ask. Please send us an email. So thank you, everybody, and I appreciate it. Well done, Dmitry. Thank you. See you on April 8th.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the time.
Cheers all. Thank you.